The woman in seat 2A had been in her seat for 11 minutes before the man with the child arrived at row 2, and she had spent most of those 11 minutes arranging things the way she preferred them arranged, which was to say precisely, the cashmere blanket folded on the armrest in a specific way, the noise-canceling headphones positioned on the seat back pocket, the small leather case that held her essential items placed in the overhead bin at an angle that would allow her to retrieve it without reaching. The flight was a private charter, a Gulfstream G650 configured for 12 passengers, booked by the Ashworth Group for a delegation traveling from New York to a conference in San Francisco. 11 people were on the manifest. Seat 2B, the one beside the woman in 2A, had been assigned to a man named Declan Morrow. She had not seen his name on the manifest. She had seen the man himself when he came through the forward cabin door carrying a dark jacket over one arm and a child on the other hip, the child perhaps 4 years old, sleeping against his shoulder with the absolute boneless commitment that small children bring to sleeping in public, one hand loosely gripping the collar of the man's shirt. The woman in 2A watched him navigate the narrow aisle toward her, and she did not smile, and she did not adjust her posture, and when he reached row 2 and confirmed his seat number with a glance at the overhead panel, she said, without introduction and without preamble, "I'd prefer not to sit next to a child on this flight. Is there another arrangement that can be made?" She said it the way people say things when they are accustomed to things being rearranged in accordance with their preferences, with the confidence of someone who has made this kind of request many times and had it honored. Declan Morrow looked at her. He looked at the seat beside her. He looked at his daughter, who had not woken. He said, "I think she'll sleep most of the way." The woman said, "That's not really the point. I'd like another seat." The cabin attendant had appeared by now in the forward galley doorway, a composed young woman named Suki, who had been briefed on the passenger list and who understood the geography of the situation. She said, quietly, that the aircraft was full and there were no alternative seat configurations available. The woman in 2A looked at Suki. She looked at Declan Morrow. She looked at the child. She said, "This is not what I expect on a charter of this caliber," and she said it loudly enough that 2 other passengers who had just boarded turned briefly in their direction before deciding that looking elsewhere was the more prudent choice. Declan said nothing further. He lowered himself into seat 2B with the practiced single-arm efficiency of someone who has done this many times, settled his daughter against his left side, reached across with his right hand and buckled his own belt, and then opened the leather folio he had been carrying against his jacket and looked at the document inside it. The woman in 2A turned to face forward. The door was sealed. The aircraft began to move. If you are watching this from a city where someone has made an assumption about a person in front of them and found out, publicly and permanently, that they were wrong, drop it in the comments right now. Subscribe and ring the bell, because this one is about what a man carries when he is not explaining himself to anyone, and about what happens at 37,000 feet when the world catches up. Stay with me. You will not want to leave early. Declan Morrow had grown up in Galway, on the western coast of Ireland, in a house that sat close enough to the Atlantic that on certain mornings in winter, the windows on the seaward side carried salt from the night, and his mother, a woman named Bridget, who taught secondary school mathematics and believed in the virtue of precision in all things, would wipe them down before breakfast with a cloth she kept specifically for the purpose. His father, Kieran, had been a harbor pilot for 22 years, guiding large commercial vessels through the shallow and technically demanding approaches to Galway Bay, in conditions that ranged from unremarkable to conditions that people who had not grown up on the Atlantic coast did not fully credit as navigable. Kieran Morrow was a man of considerable professional reputation and very few words, who expressed the things he believed about skill and patience and the relationship between knowledge and humility almost entirely through action rather than declaration. He had taken Declan out on the pilot boat from the time Declan was old enough to be trusted in it without being a hazard to the operation, and what Declan had received from those mornings was not a sentimental education but a technical one, the specific understanding of how a large and complicated system is safely managed when the margin for error is narrow and the consequences of getting it wrong are measured in lives and tonnage. He had known from early on, with the particular certainty that some children have about their own direction, that he wanted to fly. Not fly in the casual recreational sense, but in the professional and serious sense, the way his father piloted ships, with the full weight of other people's safety in his hands, and the full understanding of what that weight required. He had begun flying lessons at 16, funded by 2 years of working summers on fishing boats out of Rosaville, and he had soloed at 17 on a Tuesday morning in October with his mother watching from the aerodrome fence, not waving, because she believed that distracting a pilot on approach was bad practice regardless of the emotional circumstances. He had been accepted to the Irish Aviation Authority's Integrated ADIPEL program at 18, which was not easy to get into and which he had prepared for with the methodical seriousness his father had demonstrated was the only approach worth taking to a thing you intended to do well. He had completed the program and accumulated the hours and the type ratings in an order and at a pace that people who reviewed his logbook tended to note without prompting. His instructors described him in the assessment language of the industry as calm, precise, and unusually good in degraded conditions, which is the kind of thing that gets written about the people the industry eventually places at the front of its most important aircraft. He had spent 3 years on regional turboprops out of Dublin, 2 years on narrow-body jets flying European routes for a low-cost carrier that he stayed with long enough to accumulate the necessary hours, and then 7 years on wide-body long-haul aircraft as a first officer and then captain for a major transatlantic carrier, flying the North Atlantic track between Dublin and New York, and occasionally into Houston and Los Angeles, on the routes that kept him in the world he had decided as a teenager he was going to inhabit. The transatlantic routes had given him something he could not have acquired another way, which was the specific experience of managing a large aircraft through the North Atlantic organized track system in winter, in conditions that include the kind of weather that does not appear in training scenarios, because training scenarios are designed to be survivable by definition, and the North Atlantic in January is not always interested in being manageable. He had encountered icing events and hydraulic anomalies and a decompression at 39,000 feet over the Labrador Sea that he had handled in the way his training had prepared him to handle it, which was without drama and without delay, with the sequential discipline of someone who has thought through every step of the procedure before the procedure becomes necessary. He had never lost a passenger or bent an aircraft. He considered this the baseline requirement of the job and took no particular credit for meeting it, but the industry had been watching him meet it across 15 years and had formed its own conclusions. He had met Fionnuala Byrne on a layover in Boston, at a coffee shop near the hotel where the crew was staying, on a morning when the weather had grounded them for an extra day, and Fionnuala, who was a marine biologist doing postdoctoral research at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, had been at the same coffee shop finishing a paper that she described, when the conversation reached a natural point at which describing it was not an imposition, as an argument with reviewers, "I'm almost certainly going to win." He had said, "What's the argument?" She had told him. It had taken 45 minutes to explain, and he had followed it. She had noticed that he followed it, and the noticing had changed something between them. Fionnuala had what Declan recognized as a version of the same thing he had spent his career developing, a specific and rigorous relationship with the behavior of complex systems under real-world conditions, except that her system was the ocean and its biology, and his was an aircraft and its physics, and the overlap in their thinking turned out to be more substantial than either of them had anticipated when they began comparing notes. They had been together for 3 years and married for 2 when Fionnuala became pregnant. The pregnancy had been uncomplicated. The birth of their daughter, Aoife, had been uncomplicated. The 14 months that followed had been the period of Declan's life in which he had understood most completely what he valued, because having Aoife made certain things clear that had previously been theoretical. Fionnuala died at the end of those 14 months. A rogue wave on a research vessel in the North Atlantic, during a survey she had campaigned to lead for 2 years and that she had been leading for 11 days when the wave struck. The vessel did not sink. 2 other members of the research team were injured. Fionnuala was not recovered. Declan was at home in Dublin with Aoife when the call came. He sat on the kitchen floor for a long time afterward. Aoife was asleep upstairs. When she woke, he went up to her. He picked her up. He stood at the window of her room with her and looked at the morning and said nothing. He did not go back to flying for 8 months. In those 8 months, he had done what he could do, which was to take care of Aoife with the full attention that taking care of a 14-month-old requires, and to allow his mother and his father-in-law and Fionnuala's colleagues and the particular architecture of grief to work through him at whatever pace they worked. He had not forced the pace. He had not refused it either. He had shown up every morning to Aoife and to the day and done the next thing that needed doing, which was most days a small thing and occasionally a large thing, and always the thing in front of him. He had Fionnuala's voice on a voicemail from the morning before the wave, reminding him to collect a parcel from the post office, and he had listened to it many times and had not deleted it, and he had understood this not as something to fix, but as part of the way things were now, the specific shape of a life that had changed in a permanent way and was still, undeniably, a life. When he went back, it was not because the grief was resolved. It was because the grief was not going anywhere, and the question was only whether he was going to be useful in the middle of it, and the answer had always been yes, because being useful was the thing that organized the rest of him. He returned to the carrier, returned to the transatlantic routes, and made the arrangements that permitted this. His mother, who had retired from teaching the previous year, came from Galway 3 days a week to be with Aoife. A childminder named Mrs. Quigley, a woman of boundless competence and firm opinions about nap schedules, covered the other days. Declan structured his roster with the precision he brought to flight planning, identifying the lines that kept him within a certain number of overnights per month and refusing the ones that did not. He had been offered a command position at a private aviation company called Meridian Air 18 months after returning, which was the kind of offer that comes to the people the industry has been watching and which represented a level of professional recognition that was unmistakable. Meridian Air operated a fleet of business jets for a client roster that ran from technology executives to government delegations to sovereign wealth funds, and the command position meant flying aircraft that were different from the wide-body airliners in scale but not in technical complexity, and it meant a schedule that was more predictable and a base that was fixed at an airport 30 minutes from the house in Dublin where Aoife slept in a room with a mobile of paper birds that Fionnuala had made before she was born and that Declan had never taken down. He had been at Meridian Air for 8 months when the Ashworth Group charter was assigned to him. It was a routine booking for a company conference delegation, nothing unusual about the manifest, nothing unusual about the route. He had filed the flight plan himself the previous evening and reviewed the weather package, noting a ridge of high pressure over the Central Rockies that would make the descent into San Francisco cleaner than westbound crossings typically allowed, and briefed his first officer, a steady and experienced man named Petrov, who had come to Meridian from the Bulgarian national carrier with a logbook that Declan had read with genuine respect. They had agreed on the fuel load and the altitude strategy for the westbound crossing and arrived at the aircraft 90 minutes before departure, which was Declan's invariable habit, regardless of the aircraft type or the length of the sector, because 90 minutes before departure was when you understood what you were flying into, and that understanding was always worth the time. Aoife had been with him because the school holiday had started that morning, and Mrs. Quigley was visiting her sister in Cork, and his mother had a medical appointment she could not rearrange, and the Meridian Air operations director, a pragmatic man named Hennessy, who had been in business aviation long enough to understand that life does not always conform to scheduling requirements, had said, "Bring her. She can sleep in the crew room until you're ready to board." And she had slept in the crew room, on the small sofa with a blanket from the crew supplies, while Declan completed his pre-flight in the cockpit. And she had woken exactly when he went to collect her, and had raised her arms to him and gone back to sleep on his shoulder in the time it took to walk from the crew room to the forward cabin door. He had been in his seat for less than 3 minutes when the woman in 2A had made her request. Veronica Ashworth was 38 years old and had been the executive chair of the Ashworth Group for 4 years, which she had been given when her father moved from executive chair to chairman emeritus, and which she had, in those 4 years, done considerably more with than anyone outside the company had anticipated, and several people inside it had feared. The Ashworth Group was a diversified holding company with interests in real estate development, media, and financial services that her grandfather had founded. Her father had grown to a substantial scale, and that Veronica had been determining, over the 4 years of her chairship, needed to be rebuilt from the inside rather than simply expanded at the edges. She had been educated at schools that communicated their quality through restraint rather than advertisement, and at universities that did the same, and she had emerged from this education with a set of capabilities that the education had intended to produce, and a set of assumptions about the relationship between those capabilities and her position in any room she entered that the education had not intended to produce but had produced anyway, as a secondary effect of the environment in which the capabilities had been developed. She had spent her 20s working within the Ashworth Group's existing structure, learning how the businesses ran and where they didn't run as well as they should, and her 30s building a case inside a company that had been organized around her grandfather's certainties for a different way of thinking about what the company was for. She was not a person who thought of herself as treating people badly. She thought of herself as having high standards for the environments she occupied, and as being willing to state those standards clearly, which she considered a form of honesty. The request she had made to the cabin attendant about the seat arrangement was, in her own understanding of the moment, a reasonable expression of a reasonable preference stated directly, the way she believed preferences should be stated. She had been wrong about the reasonableness of the expression, and wrong about the reasonableness of the preference itself, and wrong, in the most consequential way, about what the situation actually was. She had not known this yet. She had turned forward in her seat and opened her laptop and was working on a document about a restructuring proposal for the Ashworth Group's media division when the aircraft finished its taxi and the cockpit door opened and the captain came through the cabin on the brief walk that some captains do before departure, a courtesy pass to acknowledge the passengers before the flight. He had changed Aoife to his right side, and she was awake now, holding a small stuffed animal that Declan kept in his flight bag for exactly these occasions, a fox with one ear slightly more compressed than the other from years of being held. And she was looking at the interior of the cabin with the wide-awake attention of a child who has just woken in an unfamiliar place and is conducting a rapid assessment. The captain stopped at each row briefly. He said something to the 2 passengers in row 1. He reached row 2, and he looked at Veronica Ashworth, and then at the man in seat 2B, and the child, and something crossed his face that was not a smile exactly, but contained the quality of a smile, the recognition of a person who knows another person and knows them in a context that carries specific meaning. He said, "Declan, you made it." The man in seat 2B looked up from his folio and said, "Of course. Wouldn't miss it." The captain said, "She going to be all right for the crossing?" Declan looked at Aoife and said, "She's grand. Slept all morning. She'll be running the aircraft by the time we land." The captain said, "I'll let Petrov know." He said it with the affection of someone who has been in the same industry as a person for long enough to find their particular qualities amusing rather than alarming. Then the captain looked at Veronica Ashworth and said, "Ms. Ashworth, welcome aboard. Captain Reed. We'll have you into San Francisco in approximately 5 hours 48." Any questions before we push back? Please don't hesitate." He turned back to Declan and said, "I'll have Suki bring you both something when we're at altitude." He said it with a specific gravity, the kind that comes from knowing a thing about a person that others in the room do not yet know but are about to. He said, "It's good to have you on board, sir," and then he went back through the cockpit door and it closed. Veronica Ashworth did not look at the man beside her for a moment. She looked at her laptop screen. She looked at the restructuring document that she had been reading when the captain came through. She looked at the words in the document without reading them. Then she closed the laptop. She had been in enough rooms with enough people to understand what the captain's manner toward the man in seat 2B had communicated. The specific quality of the deference. The sir at the end of it, which was not the sir a captain extends to a first-class passenger, but a different category of sir entirely, the kind that one professional extends to another of equivalent or greater standing, or the kind that moves in a particular direction when the standing is specific and known. She had spent 4 years as executive chair of a company that required her to read situations quickly and revise her understanding when the situation provided new data. She was revising her understanding now. She did not know yet who he was in the aviation world, specifically, and she would not know until the flight was over and she had a moment with a phone and a search, and the answer that the search returned made her sit still for longer than she had sat still in some time. But she understood from the captain's manner, from the particular texture of the exchange she had just witnessed, that she had made an assumption in the service lane of a very expensive aircraft about a man sitting beside her with a sleeping child and a canvas jacket, and that the assumption was wrong in a way that the manner of the captain of the aircraft was now communicating to the 12-passenger cabin with a clarity that required no further elaboration. She thought about the request she had made to the cabin attendant. She thought about the way she had made it. She thought about the child, who was now sitting upright in the seat beside her with the fox and looking at Veronica's laptop case with the flat analytical interest of a 4-year-old who is deciding whether to ask about something. Veronica looked at the child. The child said, "Is that a leopard?" Veronica looked at the laptop case, which was covered in a pattern that was not a leopard, but was perhaps in the same family of visual associations as far as a 4-year-old was concerned. She said, "It's a pattern. I don't know what the pattern is supposed to be exactly." The child considered this as an answer, evaluated it, and appeared to find it acceptable. She said, "I have a fox." She held up the fox. Veronica said, "I see that. What's his name?" The child said, "His name is Ship." Veronica said, "Ship." The child said, "My dad named him." She said this in the tone of someone reporting a fact about the world that they find slightly absurd but have decided to accept. Then she added, "My mum liked ships." She said this with the particular matter-of-factness of a child who has learned that certain facts about the world are simply facts, to be stated and moved on from, and who has taken her cue in this from the adult who has been demonstrating it to her every day. Declan, without looking up from his folio, said, "Ships are very important in our family." The child looked at her father and then at Veronica and appeared to conclude that this explained things sufficiently. Veronica looked at the man beside her. He was reading the document in his folio with the focused quality of someone who has learned to read in conditions that require focus, in a manner that suggested complete attention to the page and a comfortable relationship with the ambient sound of an aircraft preparing to move. His daughter had settled back against his arm with the fox and was looking at the window. Veronica said, "I owe you an apology." He looked up from the folio. She said, "What I said when you sat down. I should not have said it." He looked at her for a moment in the way he looked at things he was assessing, steadily and without urgency. She said, "I know." He said, "She really will sleep most of the crossing. She's good on planes." Veronica said, "I imagine she comes by that honestly." He looked at his daughter for a moment. He said, "Her mother was good at moving through the world without being particularly troubled by it." He said it with the evenness of someone who has said a thing enough times that the saying of it has become manageable, Not easy, but manageable. And Veronica received it the same way, not with condolence, which he had not invited, but with the simple acknowledgement of a nod. He said, "I imagine so." The aircraft was moving now, turning toward the runway threshold, and the morning light was coming through the portside windows at an angle that put a stripe of gold across the seat backs of row 3, and Aoife had closed her eyes again with the fox against her chin, and Declan returned to his document. Veronica opened her laptop. She did not read the restructuring proposal. She looked at the screen for a while and then closed the laptop again and looked out the opposite window at the taxiway lights receding as the aircraft aligned itself with the runway. She thought about the way she had said it. Not only what she had said, but the tone, the assumption baked into the tone, the certainty that the request would be honored because requests made in that tone, in her experience, had always been honored. She thought about the service advisor and the 2 passengers who had looked over and then looked away. And she thought about the child who had been asleep on the man's shoulder and had not known anything had happened and would not know. She thought about the pilot door closed at the front of the aircraft and the man on the other side of it who had come through the cabin and said, "Sir," with a specific weight she had understood immediately and would not forget. The engines came up to power, and the aircraft began its roll, and the runway went past the windows at increasing speed, and then the nose came up, and the ground fell away, and the Atlantic opened below them, wide and gray and indifferent and enormous, and the aircraft climbed into it. At cruising altitude, Suki appeared with a tray that held 2 drinks and a small plate of things suitable for a 4-year-old, which Aoife examined with the same analytical thoroughness she had applied to Veronica's laptop case, and then accepted with a selectivity that suggested specific and considered opinions about food, which she had. Declan received the tray with the ease of someone accustomed to being looked after on aircraft without making anything of it, and said thank you to Suki in the manner of someone who means it, and Suki said, "The captain asked me to let you know the weather over the Rockies looks clean." Declan said, "Tell him I appreciate it." Veronica watched this exchange. She returned to her laptop, and this time she read the document, because the work was there and because she was a person who could not be in a room without being useful to herself and to the thing she was working on. But she read it differently than she had been reading it before they had taken off, with a portion of her attention directed at the man beside her in a way that was not intrusive but was honest, a recalibration she was performing in real time. She had spent 4 years trying to make the Ashworth Group more honest about what it did not know, less reliant on the reflexive confidence of inherited position, more willing to interrogate the sources of its assumptions. She had said, in meetings and in memos and in one-on-one conversations with senior leaders who needed to hear it, that the company's problem was not a lack of information, but a failure to question the frameworks that organized the information it already had. She thought, that is exactly what I've been trying to fix inside the company, and I did it on a plane to San Francisco with a child's stuffed fox as a witness. She almost laughed. She did not laugh, but the quality of the thought was close enough to a laugh that it shifted something in her. A small but real adjustment in the way she was sitting in the seat. The restructuring proposal on her laptop was about institutional humility, about building processes that caught the errors that expertise alone could not catch. She had written 17 pages about this problem, and then sat down on a private jet and demonstrated it within 3 minutes of boarding. She did not say this to Declan Morrow. Some things do not need to be said to the person who prompted them. They landed in San Francisco at 12:41 local time, 3 minutes ahead of schedule, which Declan noted in the way people note things they care about, which is to say he noted it and moved on. Aoife had slept for the final 2 hours of the crossing and woken over Nevada with the fox and looked out the window at the Nevada terrain below and said, "It's bumpy down there." Declan said, "The basin and range, it goes like that for a long way." She looked at it for a while and then said, "I want to go there." He said, "We will." At the gate, Gathering his jacket and the folio and the bag and Aoife, Declan nodded to Veronica Ashworth once. She nodded back. Nothing further was said, and nothing further needed to be. Some exchanges finish on the ground, even when they started in the air. The crew was the last off the aircraft. Captain Reed appeared from the cockpit as the passengers deplaned, and he and Declan stood in the forward cabin for a few minutes, talking in the shorthand of people who have worked in the same industry for long enough that most of what they need to say can be said quickly. Reed said something that made Declan produce a brief and genuine sound of amusement. Aoife showed Reed the fox. Reed looked at the fox with the gravity of someone who understands that a 4-year-old showing you a thing they care about requires your full attention, and then he said to Declan, "She's got your eyes." Declan said, "She's got her mother's eyes." He said it without any particular weight and without any invitation, and Reed received it the same way. The way people receive the things a person has learned to say because the thing is true and needs saying and does not require anything from the recipient. He carried Aoife off the aircraft and through the jetway and into the San Francisco afternoon, which was bright in the particular way of San Francisco afternoons in the late part of the year, a brightness that has distance in it, that does not commit to warmth. She was asleep again before they reached the car. He had a hotel room, and 2 days before he needed to be back in the aircraft for the return. He put Aoife down in the room and sat at the small desk by the window with his phone and called his mother in Galway, who wanted to know about the crossing and about the weather and about whether Aoife had eaten anything. He told her about the crossing. He told her the weather had been clean over the Rockies. He said Aoife had eaten approximately half of what Suki had brought her and had strong opinions about the rest. His mother said, "That sounds about right." He said, "It does." She said, "She's fine?" He looked at Aoife, who was on the bed with the fox, sleeping the way she slept when she had been on an aircraft, deeply and without apparent concern for her surroundings. He said, "She's grand. She wants to go to Nevada." His mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Of course she does." He said he would call again tomorrow, and they said goodbye, and he set the phone down and looked out the window at San Francisco, which he had been to many times, and which had a particular quality in the late afternoon that he had always found interesting without being able to account for it, a clarity in the light that made distant things precise rather than soft. He thought about Fionnuala, because San Francisco was a city she had wanted to visit and had not gotten to, and he thought about her not with the specific grief that still arrived on certain mornings, but with something more ordinary, a sense of her presence as a fact that he carried, the way a pilot carries the understanding of the wind, always in account, and not always in thought. He opened the folio on the desk. The document inside it was not a restructuring proposal or a flight plan. It was the draft of a lecture he had been asked to give at an aviation safety conference in Dublin the following month, on the subject of risk assessment in degraded conditions, a topic he had agreed to address because he had specific and hard-won things to say about it, and because the conference was the kind of gathering where those things, said precisely, might do some good. He worked on the lecture until Aoife woke, and then he closed the folio and they went out to find something to eat, the two of them on a San Francisco street in the late afternoon light, and she held his hand and looked at everything with the attentiveness she brought to new cities, and when they found a place with a window table, she sat across from him with the fox on the table beside her plate and asked him to tell her what Nevada was like. He told her. He described the basin and range, the tilted fault blocks, the way the geology made a landscape that looked like something had been interrupted. He described the salt flats she could see from altitude. She listened with the quality of attention that was her mother's and asked a question that was also her mother's, which was not "what is it," but "why is it that way?" And he answered it as fully as she would follow, which was further than most people would have expected, because she was 4 years old and she was Fionnuala Burns' daughter, and the question was already native to her. The San Francisco afternoon went into evening around them, and the table had the light of a restaurant in the early dinner hour, and Aoife ate most of what was put in front of her and approved of it more than she had approved of the aircraft food, which she communicated by eating rather than by commentary. And Declan had coffee and watched her and thought that the day had been what days were when you were living them correctly, which was full of things that needed doing, and people who needed attending to, and a quality of attention you had to bring to all of it because the alternative was not available. He paid the bill and they walked back to the hotel in the last of the light, her hand in his, the fox tucked under her other arm, and the city was what it always was at that hour, specific and cool and going about its business, and he went about his.